This is lecture 2 of part 1 on R basics. The BRFSS asks people how many hours they sleep. That's the variable slept him. We'll compare that for different states. New York City is called the city that never sleeps. Let's see if we can see that in the data. Compare it with Ohio. Residents of New York State sleep a bit less on average than residents of Ohio. You might wonder, if you're begin to think like a statistician, whether that's a big difference. Hold on to that thought. With R, we can calculate the mean and standard deviation in each group of people. Note that we do have to be careful with missing values, coded as NA, so here we tell the computer to ignore those. That's NA.RM equals true. If I get my head out of the way, you can see that better. The syntax here, slept him, square bracket, X state double equals New York, tells the computer to use the values of slept him for the observations where X state is equal to New York. Note the double equal sign, that's really important. A single equals would be interpreted as assigning all the values equal to that, not checking if they're equal. As you use more complicated sets of people, you can use different logical operators to combine. The logical AND is the ampersand. Logical OR is a vertical line. Let's see on my keyboard, that's the shift of the backslash all the way over on the right-hand side. Logical NOT is an exclamation point. Note these logical values are sometimes different from colloquial use. For instance, if you wanted to define something like people of color to include people who indicated their race was something other than white, and to include people who indicated they're Hispanic, then you'd use the logical OR. Code like square bracket, regular parenthesis, XP race not equal to white, or X Hispanic double equals yes Hispanic. They're in the group either if they provide race other than white or if they're Hispanic. If instead you wrote that code with logical AND instead of logical OR, that would only pick the people with both of those values true in the intersection. Now be careful, as you go along, you have the option of saving your code and or your workspace. It's always better to save the code. For example, your code might load some data at this stage, usually data that I've provided. If you make changes to the data during your session, you do not want to restart with all those changes. Especially if you fucked up and used, like I said, just one equal sign, then you've screwed up all your data. So you go back, you change, you want to be able to rerun it. You do not want to restart with those changes already made. You want to start fresh. If you save the workspace, then you're saving all your scraps, all your changes, and those will build up. So only save your workspace if you've run a large chunk of code you don't want to have to later rerun. That's even more true if you attach data frames without later detaching them. This is a whole different approach to workflow project management. The old way, kind of the bad way, is to have something like an Excel sheet where a human goes through and makes a few changes to the original data, and those changes might be smart and good, or they might not. But they don't replicate. They're tough to remember after some time has gone by. And it's tough to track back and find errors, whether they're typos or errors from the original data. Now, as you're going along, you're copying and pasting, then you might not have trouble. But if you're typing, then you've probably realized R is kind of persnickety. The variable slept him all caps is not equivalent to slept him lowercase or slept him camel case with just the first letters capitalized. You might be wondering if there's an easier way than copy paste. There is. RStudio tries to help with auto fill-in. And if you create text in the source pane, then it's easy to go back and make corrections. Highlight text in the source pane, hit Control Enter, that'll run the block of code. Or if you've just on a line and you hit Control Enter, that will run just that line. At the beginning, you'll be probably copying commands that I give you, but you start to make changes, you have to understand what's going on. So again, remember to save your work. Computers in the lab will wipe the memory clean when you log off, so back up your files. Probably on GitHub, especially because you will be collaborating on work. Now, speaking of collaboration, for better or worse, there's rarely just a single way of doing things. People talk about the R language. It does indeed have features of a language. Like a spoken language has many ways to say hi, so too in R, there are a lot of different ways to produce means of different groups. I'll show you a few, but if you look online particularly, you might find others. There are two main file types here in this class anyway. R script, lines of instruction, how to calculate stuff, and R markdown, which combine the instructions along with the text around it. There are more types, of course, but those are the ones for now. There's a bigger philosophy here, the idea of reproducible research. That if you share your RMD file, then anybody else can run the exact same program, get the exact same results. It's a way of convincing an audience that there's no skullduggery in how the data relates to the conclusion. It's useful in class since it's an easy way to submit homework and share work with your study group. Sharing is caring. You got to get into the habit of knowing your code is not some personal scratch file that only has to work for you. Most workplaces are in teams. The code has to be understandable more broadly. There are times when it's useful to think of your future self as some different person. I do that. I load old code and I yell sometimes, but I hate the fucking asshole that wrote this code. Yeah, that was me. Set good habits at the beginning. Just like if you have your own desk in your own office, maybe it's a mess. That's your choice. But if you share a space, you know you got to be neater and not be that slob that everyone else hates. You're coding too. You'll be sharing code with your study group. Put it on GitHub, share it around. So now we've got some inkling of how to structure the code. Let's go deeper on how some of those variables are coded. I put the complete code book in the zip file. You can dig in and check details. Some of a natural interpretation. For instance, slept him is measured in hours. But even that, not quite. If you look more deeply, you'll see that every answer is rounded to the nearest whole number. The underlying variable might be a real number, but it's coded to an integer. We also have to be careful about interpreting NA responses. This could mean any of a variety of things. Perhaps the person asking the question skipped a part, accidentally or intentionally. Perhaps a responder gave a long answer that just didn't fit a coding. For instance, if asked about whether they got a COVID shot, the response is a diatribe about the government telling people what to do. Perhaps they just outright refused to answer. In many of these cases, the person just wasn't asked. For instance, compare these two, summary sex var, summary birth sex. If you didn't check the number of NA values in birth sex, you'd have a very odd view. Most people aren't asked a separate question about sex assigned at birth. That's kind of a complicated topic for some people. The data presented here is an imperfect description of reality. Sometimes the results of a tension between the people creating the survey and the people answering. Reality is more complicated than simple answers, even in a well-designed survey. Some variables are a Likert scale, such as Gen Health, basically asking people to rate their health on a scale from 1 to 5. Sometimes it's useful to treat those as numbers we can do math with. Sometimes not. Note here the middle value is labeled as good. Other Likert scales might ask people to rate from 1 to 10 or 1 to 7. It's really not an underlying reality we can point to ask whether the person answered correctly. Many of the BRFSS variables are factors, and our language provides a lot of help with them. Basically, a factor lumps together a bunch of 0-1 answers. Mapping logical operations onto math is a great help here. The factor X Hispanic is a single yes, no, or 0-1 answer. Is the respondent Hispanic? But then Educ A is a whole bunch of yes, no answers. Is the person's highest completed educational level only kindergarten or never had school? Is the person's highest completed educational level grade 1 to 9? Then did they get through some high school? Did they end after getting a high school diploma, etc.? When you ask for a summary of Educ A, R helpfully provides labels for all those together. For various cases, we might want to combine some of these together. It's important to remember there are some cases where the factor values are well ordered, as with highest educational qualification, and others, like X state, the state the person lives in, where there's not necessarily an ordering. Except New York is one, but whatever. Factors are really useful, enough that different people have developed packages specifically to manipulate factors. Now, R depends crucially on packages. That's the whole reason the open source works so well. Some statistician invents a cool new technique, writes up the code in R, and makes it available for everybody. If you used a commercial program, you'd have to wait a decade for them to update it and then pay for the update. In R, it's here right now. Also, if somebody hacks a nicer or easier way to do stuff, they write that up. Packages are extensions for specific file tasks, and you can tell R to install specific packages. Many people who use R don't need to create detailed maps, but if you want that, there's a package. If you want to analyze genetic sequences, there's a package. Hadley Wickham wrote forcats for categorical data factors. It's part of the tidyverse package. So you type into the console install.packages parenthesis tidyverse, install.packages parenthesis PLYR, that's also helpful. And then you type library parenthesis tidyverse, library parenthesis PLYR. Alternatively, from RStudio, you can click Tools, then Install Packages, and tell it to install the package, tidyverse, for instance. That's nice if you want to see some of the packages or if you don't quite remember the name. The next piece of code, library, tells the program that you want to use commands from this package. You only need to install once, but you need to put library in your code each time when you start up the program, and you got to run that part. Oh, god damn, I lost this. Here we go. Now, R will do summaries differently for factors. Summary X age 5 year, which age in 5-year bands, summary income. And I know we'd like if age or income were a regular number, not a factor, but that's what the summary provides. It's a way of helping keeping confidentiality. You want to find the mean and standard deviation of sleep time by income, you could use something like that line of code. DDPLY is the particular command with our BRFSS 22 data. By income, summarize, mean, standard deviation, number of observations. Tapply would also work here, but I think this is a little nicer. We could do percentiles, now 90th and 10th percentiles, some code like that. For factors with fewer items, you could do table or crosstabs. Those commands are pretty straightforward. If you want proportions instead of counts, then prop table. Remember prop table later on when we do marginals. It'll be important.